Hi, everyone. This is a unit that's going to give you a number of options to apply your technical skills and also to continue to hone your ability to make meaningful artwork. So I'd like you first to, in your sketchbook, write down this learning target. I can apply self-awareness and self-discipline to create a meaningful work of art. Now, by way of a reminder, when we make artwork, we can use our process, our unpacking process backwards. So we can just call it packing. And when we have our packing applied to the creation of a work of art, what we want to do is put meaning inside of it by starting with our theme, which I'm going to give you three options today. Then from there, we want to go backwards, think about the emotion that we want to communicate. When we have the emotion and the theme in hand, we can begin to think about the image references and the audience that we want to connect with. These are really important, particularly if the artwork you're gonna make is intended to persuade or otherwise communicate an idea, which ultimately it should. So we're going to go through a number of things, three different kind of theme possibilities. And I'd very much like in the course of this work, if you would write down two things that do not interest you relative to these ideas and two things that do interest you. And there are postcards from tomorrow, dichotomous themes, and visual persuasion. So again, as a reminder, as you think about what interests you, think about possible references that come to mind, emotions that come to mind, and try to develop, I guess, a sense of your self-interest, like what raises your curiosity as we go through these three options and which would be able to fill these spaces the best and the most quickly for you. So the first is postcards for tomorrow, and postcards have a long and illustrious history of being a piece of visual culture that we receive from places where we are not present. They communicate something to us from a faraway place. They capture for us an understanding of a world that we can't quite see, and usually are in some ways a placeholder for some other faraway reality. I pulled these from a couple websites. This one is a location in Canada. You can get ones that depict, of course, very historic places that have long passed or ruins. But artists, of course, use postcards as well to design, simply to make beautiful. And in these cases, these postcards are very imaginative and they capture something that isn't really there or kind of there, but do it in a very stylized way. Now, in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a project called Post Secret where people shared postcards and shared their secrets. They shared stories of their life that were private, and they did it anonymously. And they did it in visual ways. So they took photographs, created montages, collages, infused text into the postcard to tell stories. And some of these, if you look up the Post Secret resource, which I'm going to ask you to do, you'll find that some of them are very, very powerful, where the secrets are more than just who likes me and I like you. that some of them are, in some ways, tragedies. But again, postcards can also not only show a place, but they can depict um, things that might capture our imagination, not just about ourselves. And of course, artists use postcards for a variety of reasons. The Griffin and Sabine books, which are a fabulous resource, they depict postcards that are received from a writer in another and faraway place. They contain a lot of mystery. They use some of the symbols of postage and mail, but also the symbols of the exotic and the faraway. Now, students in this class have made postcards before and previously, and done so in many, many ways, from collage and multimedia to painting to writing. And these postcards also contain some mystery. They tell stories like this one about home and experience. This one is about being home and being away from home. And these were about a student's experience with a family member that had difficulties with addiction. Using some classic art, you'll notice the use of the romantic nightmare here, but also the Wyeth painting, Christina's World, which we studied, and recycled those images to tell new stories. So the first choice of assignment is for you to make postcards from yourself at the very end of your experience. And you're going to create 8 postcards if you choose this assignment about your life and the story of your life from the point of view of your future self. So as a postcard is a placeholder of place, it can also be a placeholder of time. And in this sense, these 8 postcards are going to be from you to you, reflecting on the things you've accomplished and or the challenges you've had. The second option is the dichotomous themes. And a dichotomy is a division or a contrast between two things. It is opposite things, and opposite things don't normally go together well. If somebody said to you, hey, look, it's raining and not raining, or it's really bright out and really dark out, you would immediately question their thinking. But in the world of art, we can put opposite things together, like this traditional still life that marries death and life, opulence and poverty. Contemporary artists do this too. Banksy's Flower Chucker demonstrates a protester who's protesting not with bricks or rocks, but with flowers. So protesting in a way that's peaceful. You've got this action that seems aggressive. The covered mouth in this case indicates that the person is in a situation where there's probably tear gas being used, but the action is one of throwing peace, not throwing something that would be otherwise destructive. This work by Magritte shows both daytime and nighttime at the same time. This is, again, one of those dichotomies that you can't quite capture in real life, but in a work of art you can. This Chicago artist, Jim Nutt, who is well known from his work in the 70s, captures both beauty and ugliness at the same time. So portraits tend to be, depicting the beautiful, and the color and the style and the shapes are interesting. They're elegant, but problematically, the face itself is distorted and somewhat almost rotting in a sense. So we have two very opposite experiences with a work like this. The Murakami work, of course, is so happy and overwhelmingly so that it becomes disgusting and saccharine. So the balance here is excessive, and in its excessiveness, the happiness seems more creepy than happy. Installation, sculpture, that's both beautiful in the sense that it's colorful and interesting and captures our attention, but also horrifying, the fact that it is a skull vomiting. And this dichotomy through two very American but oppositely American things, we've got Mickey Mouse, the picture of entertainment, and George Washington, who is, both a picture of courage and American spirit. Married together in this way, there's silliness, there's interest, and it highlights some of these differences. Some student dichotomies here. Death as a figure also being playful. This one, both a lion and a butterfly. A dove and a war. And a few other dichotomies. Again, middle school kids and the notion of the deceased, certainly of interest, but life of the party, right there on the sickle, telling a story, a bird flying, but also caged. These are your dichotomy choices. And I think it's worth noting that in this, I'm curious what two things interest you and what two things do not interest you. Now, we've talked about monsters, and this is not one that you will have to do for our packing project, but I do want to speak to you about persuasive art. And art, of course, has a long history of being persuasive. The visual world has a long history of being very persuasive. Picasso's Guernica, which was made in response to bombing during the Spanish Civil War, depicted the loss of children and women in this small town. This painting was owned by the UN, and it was made to be an anti-war sentiment. Now, interestingly, when the United States was arguing to the UN for invading Iraq and going to war in 2003, the Secretary of State of the U.S. had it covered up because they didn't want to present in front of this anti-war piece to make the case. Now, censoring certainly, or maybe hiding away a work of art, actually in some ways makes it more powerful, but it also speaks to the inherent power of the work to say that and to persuade about some of the horrors of war. So, Picasso made this for the 1937 World's Fair, and it became an international success. But if we go forward into the 1980s, some artists were trying to persuade in different ways. The Guerrilla Girls, spelled like the form of warfare, would take out ads in major magazines and newspapers and give reports on the state of the art industry. So here they're giving report card-like grades to galleries on their ability, on their history of showing female artists. And in the 1980s, there was a very lopsided representation of women in the gallery scene. And the Guerrilla Girls took it upon themselves to make their art really a form of marketing about the representation of women in the art business. Kenji Yonobi is a contemporary Japanese artist who's influenced by like 1980s, 1990s video games, Japanese culture, and living in the atomic/nuclear era. So we've talked about Godzilla as a result of the atomic bombs being dropped, but Yonobi travels to places where there have been fallouts related to, you know, the use of nuclear power in some way or another. Here, he's in Chernobyl in his created suit, going through some of the cities and documenting it to remind people about uh, things that are still happening to this day relative to the actual spill, which I'll get to in a minute. So, certainly, some of his sculptures and photographs are unnerving, and for a valid reason. They're meant to persuade, to bring attention to what had happened in Chernobyl in the 80s. The amount of radiation that was released was more than the two bombs that were dropped in Japan. And nearby town of Belarus, um, which is now abandoned largely, was infected with high doses of radiation. Certainly, we can recognize that these are people's lives, but one thing that occurred pretty commonly is that adults that were exposed had very, very high rates of cancer, as we can imagine. But children that were born thereafter and that are still alive and were born well into the 90s were born with major developmental delays, like these young people here who are living inside of a state-run facility. They have very little capacity to use their bodies and brains in many ways. And Yonobi is interested in telling their story and being persuasive in the sense that he will let people be aware that these are things that are still happening in the world, even though they've fallen out of a news cycle. Now, the challenges that these kids have, and now young adults have, is very different kid to kid. This young man who is documented by a photographer has an issue where his brain works in a sense of heightened adrenaline all the time. His fear, his fight or flight is always in full gear, where most of us can oh, I'm afraid and I'll calm myself down. He doesn't have this capacity. This person has the challenge of this kind of self harm behavior where needs to wants to kind of scratch and bite at himself and needs to be wrapped accordingly. And some of the kids that are in these facilities, and as I said, now young adults, have what's called elephantitis, where they actually their brains work fantastic, but parts of their body that help them grow are misaligned and grow in unusual and kind of excessive rates. So Yonobi's work in many ways is about persuading people to just remember and be aware of other situations that are happening. And artists do this all over in many ways, sometimes like in Yonobi's case by evoking a feeling of something's not right. And then we ask questions about, well, what is it that he's trying to tell? And when we see these dolls and we see these unusual sculptures, we get put down the road of asking questions that elevate our awareness. Banksy's work between two warring countries where there's a border wall, he kind of in a covert fashion goes to this place, which is a disputed border where people are constantly fighting, and there's people will build a settlement, people will blow it up, people will attack it, people will bomb it, and there's this continuous back and forth. And he went to one of these walls and painted openings and cracks. Now, in doing so, he put his life on the line. Certainly, if he was seen by any one of the guards, he would have been shot. But in doing this, he's trying to help persuade and think of a world, obviously, without this wall, without this border, to think of this kind of opening up and this possibility that, in some ways, the way he depicts it is more beautiful, but also a little bit hopeful. So he is a graffiti artist and a painter, but His work tends to be kind of like the flower chucker about persuading people to think differently about the challenges of the day. So in this street art where he's put "keep your coins, I want change," using synonyms for change to get someone to think about the possibility of like, well, is it really just a little bit of money that's going to help this individual, or is it something more that is more systematic? Of course, as a graffiti artist, he's very much pro graffiti art. And here, one of his works where he's comparing, the mark making of the graffiti artist to the mark making of the cave painters, and how that is considered both a national and international treasure. Kind of asking a question of the mark making of people on the side of a building or the side of a train car is also equally treasured. Probably one of my favorites, the crying, whining child, because he's got no likes, no comments, and no ads. Very much, I think, a strong image for our time. Some student work, being persuasive about having access and being able to use one's voice. Student work on the left about growing up too fast, and student work on the right about kind of being overwhelmed with images of beauty and being kind of directed to think about being beautiful in almost kind of constructed ways. This is a montage about violence on television. This one about the worth of people, gold, silver, bronze, all depicted here, and who makes that call. A persuasive work about mothers that drink while pregnant. A persuasive work about the environment and what happens to our garbage. And a persuasive work about guns and weapons. Now, the persuasive works here, and the topic was entirely up to you. But what matters is that whatever persuasive work you choose, you have to think about making artwork for not people that already agree with you, but people that disagree with you. So like in this case, the first feeling is like, oh, this is really beautiful. Like there's something interesting. And then you look a little closer and you realize that everything is compiled of some kind of plastic or trash. Even in light of the fact of the beautiful colors, the beautiful greens and blues and the sun, there's that contrast, a little bit of a dichotomy again, but ultimately to persuade and convince people and pull them into a conversation and a thoughtfulness about what happens to our garbage. So for that, your final one, what I'm interested in is two things that might interest you or two things that don't interest you. Actually, I'm interested in both. And then moving forward with those and from those to extend your ideas today about what might be possible for you. Because you'll have to pick one of those three, either postcards from tomorrow, dichotomous themes, or a persuasive work. And then over the next 2.5 weeks, we will be working on this project, packing it, developing it, and bringing it to fruition. But before we get to our close before Thanksgiving break.